hate Genshin Impact. I have tried on no less than 3 separate occasions to really delve into Genshin and find the joy that so many of my friends see, and every time I can never get into it. Genshin Impact is an odd homunculus of other established video game concepts and designs repackaged into baby's first anime game. The core gameplay resembles something akin to Zelda Breath of the Wild, with a large open world to discover, minor encounters with enemy monsters, and almost beat-for-beat combat. But despite all of that, they want you to play it like a more typical RPG with all of these gear menus, elemental attack combos, and a million different forms of XP and currency to keep up with. 2 systems that don't really complement each other at all. And we can't make it this far without mentioning that the whole game is built on this gacha system. If you want any of the new fancy characters, you have to pony up and buy a random chance to unlock them. And this game has such a distinct style that it adheres all of its characters to so strongly that they all kinda begin to blend together, and I fail to understand why anyone would spend money on the chance to unlock one. Obviously, I have my criticisms of this game, but for as much as I may loathe Genshin Impact, you can't really deny its success. It's fucking everywhere. Every time I go to a con, there's like a million people dressed as Genshin characters, and in a world of pretty terrible live service offerings, Genshin is honestly a remarkably good value proposition. It gets updates really frequently, with significant expansions to both the overworld and the lore, and most of the characters' movesets are shared between weapon types. So if you're not particular, you can experience basically all of this game's content, which is a lot, without spending $1. My first session in Genshin, I got a lady with a big sword who can prevent my team from taking damage, and I got a lady with a spear. And since then, I have not looked back. I don't love this game. I would struggle to say that I like it, but I have dumped some time into it. It's free and it can be decent fun. It's video game comfort food. It goes down easy, but it's kinda bad for you. I got nothing to do for the next hour? Might as well explore the new chunk of the Genshin map. I don't dislike Genshin because I think it's bad. I dislike it because I think it's stupid and boring. But only one of those statements should hold any value to you. I'm not destined to be a Genshin fan. I think that much is clear. But I have to admit, I'm really jealous of those who are. The devs over at MiHoYo are clearly good at their job, and if I could just get in on the ground floor of a newer title of theirs, I would love to get fully immersed in one of their worlds. Enter stage left, Zenless Zone Zero. Zenless Zone Zero, or ZZZ, or ZZZ for my non-US audience, is the latest title from developer MiHoYo, the newest addition to the Hoyo-verse. And while I may have had my beef with their past titles, I had a hard time pretending that I wasn't interested in this one. While Genshin Impact to me always felt like an uninspired mishmash of existing conventions, from the first trailer, Zenless Zone Zero felt new and exciting, shifting away from an open-world fantasy adventure game into a cyberpunk hack-and-slash spectacle brawler, a genre that I feel like we have been sorely missing in the modern age. And while this isn't their first title since the monumental release of Genshin Impact, that honor going to Honkai Star Rail, this is the first release that felt like something completely new from the studio. I was genuinely excited to check out Zenless. I really thought it had the potential to be something special, which is why I'm so disappointed to report back and say that I didn't like it very much. In Zenless Zone Zero, humanity has been near completely wiped out by these monsters known as ethereals, who originate from these portals called hollows. In the city of New Eridu, several mercenaries take on work fighting these ethereals and doing missions within the hollows. But in order to navigate them properly, they need someone on the outside, a proxy. And that is where we come in. Weirdly enough, Zenless Zone Zero's main playable cast aren't the main characters of this story. Our protagonist, whichever one of these two you like more, is the guy in the chair, which is really smart for a game like this. In a gacha game, the characters you start out with usually tend to be kind of bad and unexciting in order to entice you to buy more characters later, and making our protagonist here not one of the playable fighters was a good call to continually keep us invested in them. Because our protagonists or proxies, a unique menagerie of new faces are routinely dropping by their video store and requesting their services, resulting in a more episodic, ongoing story. Things are chunked out into days, with different quests appearing depending on what time it is, usually revolving around 1 or 2 new faces showing up, doing a couple missions with them, and then on to the next thing. There's an ongoing narrative with the way big corporations treat those under them, and this AI device that our protagonists pick up, but right off the bat, I hate how Zenless Zone Zero presents its story. The game opens with this big, super involved cutscene, and credit where credit is due, the game looks fantastic. I've seen a lot of people call this over-animated, but man, I love how expressive everything is here. Problem being, the game does not keep up that momentum. We start off with these bombastic cutscenes, and then we shift into these motion comics, which, you know, fair enough, not every cutscene can look this good, animation's expensive, but then after that, we shift into these talking head segments and my eyes begin to glaze over as all the information presented to me just becomes noise. If you go into this game expecting the non-stop zoomer-brained action that this genre typically offers, you're in for a rude awakening. They love to make you sit and smell the roses. For example, early on you meet Nekomata, a catgirl bandit who comes off as a bit of a scoundrel but actually has a heart of gold, and she demonstrates this to us by deciding to save a child in a precarious position over her own personal benefit. And rather than having that displayed to us in like a quick 5-second motion comic or something, we instead get to listen to her debate with the team about it for a long time, including every named character weighing in on how relieved they are that she's actually a good guy. Near every plot point, fun joke, or character-defining moment is drilled into you 4 or 5 times, and it's like, I feel like there's a way forward here where you can remove a lot of this dialogue and use the money you save from not paying voice actors as much for animators to create more higher caliber cutscenes and have the same amount of story told. I get that this is a gacha game and you want to shine as much attention on these lively, purchasable characters as possible, but I think you could get away with less screen time per character outside of combat if you made the screen time they do get more impactful. And it's made all the worse by the fact that our main cast doesn't feel particularly deep or worthy of exploration. I get that this is probably by design, but it's an RPG, I want to care about my party, and if you've watched any popular anime, you probably have had your fill of the archetypes these characters embody already. It's a lot of pretty by-the-numbers stuff explained to you in far more dialogue segments than I think anyone could ever need, and I could excuse this if the gameplay was super strong, but the gameplay is pretty by the numbers too. Part of the reason I was so excited by Zenless Zone Zero was how good and fluid all of the combat looked in the trailers. It harkened back memories of stuff like Devil May Cry or Bayonetta. And while in motion, it definitely looks like those titles, it doesn't feel like those titles. Zenless's combat isn't like a spectacle brawler as much as it is like a souped up version of the aforementioned Genshin Impact. Every character has their one basic combo string, a heavy attack, an ultimate ability, and that's pretty much it. It's not as bad as its predecessor. I feel better mashing the square button in this than I do in Genshin, and that's not as insignificant as I just made it sound, but on their own, every character feels exceedingly basic. And they almost get around this by having the swap characters button double as a parry, and a pretty satisfying one at that. Enemies have these big sweeping attacks that you can parry pretty easily, meaning that you're constantly switching between your squad of 3, and in the short bursts of gameplay you're typically afforded, this is perfect. But the second you mess up a parry or a fight lasts slightly too long, you get blasted back to reality and realize you've spent most of the combat button mashing. And while you can extend combos and pull off some pretty intricate stuff if you really want to, the game never really incentivizes you to play it like that. A couple more combo strings per character, or maybe like a jump button for some air combos would have made all the difference, but instead, it's super basic gameplay that pretends like it's something super advanced. Zenless Zone Zero has what I like to call MMO Brainrot. Everything here is so clearly catered to the players who are going to dump 1,000 hours into the game that it becomes almost alienating for a first-time player. With things like never-ending tutorials, really long-winded descriptions for abilities that seem pretty straightforward when you use them, and gear buffs so hyper-specific that you have a hard time actually figuring out what tangible benefit they add to your gameplay. And you know, for most actual MMOs, you need this kind of information overload to be able to catch up on years worth of content expansion, but you can't really say the same thing for the anime-inspired hack-and-slash RPG that came out like 2 weeks ago. And considering the fan base that these games typically tend to attract, most of whom already have a passing familiarity with how these games tend to operate due to similar mechanics in past Hoyoverse titles, this definitely was the right call. But it's still a huge roadblock for any new players. Obviously you gotta appeal to your hardcores, but you get more hardcores by making the first 10 hours so good that people wanna play the next 1,000. And this MMO Brainrot affects everything. The gameplay, how it handles the story, the mountains upon mountains of side content that the game introduces every other second with the same level of importance, it's overwhelming in the worst way possible. In my opinion, this is the biggest issue that plagues Zenless Zone Zero in its current state. If you're not immediately sold on the concept and ready to devour every tiny piece of introductory text, things become a major slog. And this sucks because I really wanted to like Zenless Zone Zero, but this game isn't made for people who want to like it, it's for people who already like the other Hoyoverse games and don't really want to expand past that horizon. And again, I can't fault developer MiHoYo for making a game that appeals to their base, but it kinda makes me feel stupid for trying to get into it, especially when there's so much here that I like. Like the characters. Most of them have pretty typical anime-ish personalities, but look at these designs! Look at the fun, futuristic, but somehow also retro aesthetic. And need I point out how nice the cutscenes look again? The game just has a good vibe to it. The characters are still locked behind gacha pulls, a statement that especially hurts my heart because this roster is really well designed, and from what I can tell, all feature completely unique movesets. It's better at making me want the characters they're trying to sell me. I ended up getting this Ice Wolf guy and made him the main powerhouse of my team, but I have to admit, looking at who I could get, they were doing some major FOMO to me. A good chunk of them contain certain lecherous choices that I don't love, a la every woman breastily bouncing boobily through every combat encounter. And like, listen, I don't hate fan-servicey character designs, but you can tell when a character is tastefully sexualized for the love of the craft or just horny bait, and this feels much more like the latter. But that incredibly small nitpick aside, I quite like this playable cast, and I also quite like the mission structure they're forced into. The gameplay is at its best when experienced in small chunks, and they capitalize on this by having combat sections spaced out between these wider TV dungeons. I don't know if anything here is particularly worth writing home about, but it's inventive. The way they tell the story through these dungeons is genuinely unique and charming. One of my favorites featured a gimmick where you lay down train tracks behind you as you move, having to deliver a package through several objectives. And I remember sitting there and being like, wow, they really know how to make the most out of a basic concept like this. You feel like you've seen everything after only one, yet they somehow keep finding ways to liven it up afterwards. I kept discovering these little pockets of joy, these small bits of world intrigue, but the core was just... It was just not interesting to me. I didn't like anything enough to stick to it, and after 13 hours of mostly just okay gameplay with marathons of dialogue reading between them, I gave up on Zenless Zone Zero. I think my biggest issue with this game is that it didn't come out 10 years ago. When I was 14 with no money and all the time in the world, something like this would have eaten me alive. Tons of missions to power through, no shortage of side content, mini games, and the promise of more updates to come? That's great. But it's great for someone who has more time to get properly invested in something like this than me. I don't dislike Zenless Zone Zero because I think it's bad. I dislike it because I think it's disappointing. And one of those is so much worse. But for as much shit as I've been giving the game, it's important to keep in mind expectations. I came into this game expecting a new take on hack and slash combat, but what Zenless Zone Zero actually is a better Genshin Impact. They're both action games where you gacha pull for new characters, and while they fall into a lot of the same pitfalls, Zenless is definitely the stronger take on this idea, in my opinion. The characters are all far more distinct, both visually and mechanically. The game feels like its own thing instead of a pretty direct translation of one of the best games of last decade, and this ongoing development cycle complements the more structured gameplay Zenless has on offer far better. And for that reason, I have a hard time directing too much negativity towards this title. Like, yeah, okay, sure, I wanted something different, but at the end of the day, it's not for me, and I'm okay with that. It's more of a refined iteration on that same old Hoyoverse style. Something that I am sure will have its fans, but I'm just not one of them. If you know what you're getting into, I bet you'll like it just fine. Zenless Zone Zero gets a give it a shot out of 10. I don't like it, but I agree with it, and I think that's more important. See ya!